Welcome back to the second part of the GBADs dashboard tutorial. Previously I covered how to set up a Dash application in Python and also how to use some basic Dash components. So if you haven't watched that, I'd recommend taking a look at that first to get a hang of Dash. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over some of the GBADs design elements that are used on the main website and on dashboards. All the following elements can be integrated with components that from the last tutorial using inline styling or CSS. I've also included some resources for learning CSS in the PDF guide, so you can check that out. So let's start off with the most obvious element, which is color. I feel that this is one of the elements that stands out the most. These colors are taken directly off of the main GBADs website from here, as you can see. We can also use these colors in our dashboards by styling elements through CSS or inline styling. Next up, we have typography, or the fonts that are being used. Again, these are from the same source taken directly from the main GBADs website. There's two main fonts here, and they're used for different types of text styling. So, for example, headings and just body. Finally, we have the branding, which consists of the GBADs logo. Here, I've included links to the PNGs of the logo hosted online in black and in white. Since the logo is just made of text, you can actually just recreate the logo in text as well using the second font found here and then the colors that we found up here. Now let's take a look at the PPS dashboard template. I'll be switching over to running this locally so you can get a better look at the template. First, let's take a look at the PPS dashboard template. Here you can see all the things that we talked about in the last tutorial. Starting off with the imports. Here we can see all the imports that we used last time. Except this time the dash import is a bit different since we're running it locally and not in Jupyter. Next, I set up my external style sheet that I'm using for this dashboard. And right after that, I have the app variable again. And this line looks a bit different than from the Jupyter notebook because we're running it locally again. I've also set up some links to the GBADs logo to make the image easier to use. Next, I've just set up some attributes to make using some of the components easier for me. Here we can see a variable for the range for the sliders. This will make it easy to calculate since this is actually going to be processed from a file. Next, we just have some tab styling for the tabs. And finally, I just have a pre-made drop-down component for the inputs because this template has a lot of drop-downs. Next, we see the page layout. Here's where all the components of the page can be found. And you can see that it kind of looks like an HTML tree. There's a mix of HTML and Dash components, as you can also see. It starts off with the HTML div, which holds all the components for the layout. I use the divs just to separate the different parts of the dashboard, as you would do in HTML. First, I have the logo, which has a CSS class top just for positioning. Next, I have all the sidebar components in this div. As you can see, there's many drop-downs here. Starting off with the source drop-down, which has some options in its attributes. Next, we have more drop-downs. This is just the pre-made one that I mentioned above here. And at the bottom of the menu, there's also a button to generate the data for the graphs. In this dashboard, there's no callbacks to generate the data, so this is just an example of what a button would look like. There's also another button to open and close the side area. Now let's take a look at the right side of the dashboard. Here we can find another div which holds all the main components for the tab component. There are multiple tabs here, 3 right now. There is a playground tab, a map tab, and a metadata tab. So in the playground, there's a graph component here. This graph is not being generated right now, as there's no callbacks to generate the data. In the map tab, we can see that there's also another graph component, except this one would generate a map. And in the final tab, there's a text area. However, this isn't used for input. Since the attribute read only is true, it's only used to display text, and it's being used here to display a large amount of text. As you can see, we're using the styling that was used above for these tabs. And then on the bottom, we can see some more inputs. This is below the tabs. There's 3 components here which show up based on callbacks. The first one is a range slider to select in between a list of years. The next is a regular slider for the map to select a single year. And finally, there's another text area, except this one is used for input since there's no attribute for read only. Here you can also see some inline styling for some of the components. For example, this div has styling for its dimensions. And that's essentially the entire layout for the template. Next, we have callbacks. This first set of callbacks are used to make the sidebar slide in and back. As you can see here, I'm using the attributes of different components and changing them to make the sidebar move. The first one changes the text on the button. The second one changes the styling so that the CSS can handle the change in position of the sidebar. And the final one is doing the same thing, just for the other div, so that it can take its place. Similarly, these next set of callbacks are used to update the components in the bottom section. So the slider, the range slider, and the text area, based on which tab is selected. One of the inputs is what the tab is, and then the output is the class to show which component should be there based on the tab. So these are pretty much all the components of the dashboard. This final line is just to run the app. So now that you've seen the dashboard code and all the components put together, I'll show you how to run the app. So now I'll show you how to run this template dashboard that we just walked through. So to run a dashboard application in Python, first thing you want to make sure is that you're in the correct directory. After that, you would type in Python plus the file name for the Python file with the dashboard. When you enter that, it'll take a while and open up your dashboard on port 8050, the default port, because we haven't specified which port it should go to. And clicking this will show you your dashboard. So now here we can see our dashboard running with all the different tabs and all the inputs. Quickly just go through and show you how all the components lay out. So on the side here, we can see all the drop downs that were used here. As you can see, this first drop down is disabled, and then the rest of them are just they don't have any options in them yet. Next you can see on the side that where the tabs are, the playground tab, which has a graph which isn't generated currently. Then the map tab, which also has a graph for the map, which would hold the map, which is also not generated currently. And then the metadata tab, which would hold a large amount of text for this text area, since you can't edit it. The bottom part consists of the range slider, regular slider, and the metadata, and it changes according to the callbacks that I mentioned earlier. So by using CSS styling, you can do things such as rounding corners and lay out the components the way you want to, with spacing and margins. I have a style sheet right here which has all the different styles that I've used. Most of it is just for positioning the components in the correct spot. But if you want to add any styling to yours components, you can do that through the same style sheet as well, just by adding another style and then using that as the class name in one of your components, as seen here. When I talked about callbacks, I talked about this sidebar moving. So that can be seen here, where when you click this button, it's seen as an input, and that's when the text on the button changes. And that's also when the divs change positioning, so that this side div disappears and this div takes the entire space. The same thing happens on this div down here when the tabs change. So first it starts off with a range slider, and then it switches to a regular slider for 1 year, and then it switches to a text area. So here you'd be able to add more tabs to add more content to the dashboard, and similarly you could add different types of inputs as necessary.